The neighbors thought it was odd, but 93-year-old Morton was dating again. One Monday morning, Morton woke up with a funny feeling that something important had happened last night. It was during breakfast that Morton finally remembered what it was. He had proposed to Greta. He decided to call Greta. He just couldn't seem to remember some things, though. Morton picked up the phone and dialed and said, "Hi, Greta. This is Morton. I have a funny question to ask you. Do you remember last night when I proposed to you?" "Oh my," Greta said, "I am so glad you called. I knew I said yes to somebody and I couldn't remember who it was." Well, let's imagine that you were hitched, you were married. Now, there are three kinds of marriages. There are miserable marriages, there are mediocre marriages, and there are magnificent marriages. I hope if you're a child of God that you are striving for that final kind, a magnificent marriage. You can't have a perfect marriage. That ain't happening. You can't take two flawed, imperfect people and create something perfect. But what you can do is you can take two imperfect people and you can be so committed to the Lord and so committed to one another that no matter what you experience together, you can create a magnificent marriage that glorifies God and inspires others to understand God's ideal for marriage. Until death do us part. So let's assume that you were married. And what you did all during your marriage is you hoed your row. Your marriage is kind of like a row in a garden. Now, not everybody hoes their row all the way to the end. Some people quit hoeing their row. Statistics about marriage and divorce are very sad in our culture. But let's assume you chose to hoe your row all the way to the end. Now, for some, maybe it was a real quick end. Something happened tragically, some sort of catastrophic health event, and the person died that you were married to. Crushing, horrific, sudden blow. Maybe the last several feet of your hoeing was very difficult because you were a caregiver and you struggled with a really difficult time. But you did exactly what you promised, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. Or let's assume that you were married and you experienced a divorce. Maybe your husband or your wife just left you. You know, it takes two to get married. It only takes one to blow the marriage up. Not everybody who's experienced divorce wanted that experience. We need to remember that. Sometimes people experience divorce because they choose it. Other times they experience it because that other person they were married to decided it was not going to be until death do us part for them. They were going to quit. So now you are no longer married in a coupled world. You might think about getting married again? If you had a good marriage, there are two ways you might look at it. You might look at it and say, man, I had a great marriage. I would love to have a second bite of the marital apple because I had a great marriage. Or you might have had a great marriage and you might look at it totally different. You say, I had a great marriage. We had many wonderful years together. I'm fulfilled because of that. And maybe you never choose to get remarried. Now, if you had a bad marriage and it ended in divorce, you might decide, boy, I would like to have a good marriage. Surely there's a good marriage that I could possibly experience. I'd like to be married again. Well, maybe you're in that situation and you're looking at it totally different, and you're saying to yourself, there is no way I'm going to take a chance on getting married again. That first marriage was so miserable, and I'm not going to take any chances of going through that misery again. See how complicated this is? When was the last time you ever sat in a Bible class where that kind of differing perspective was talked about or was studied about? I'll make another confession. I've made a few this weekend being with you. Here's another confession. I avoided this subject like the plague for the first couple of years that I was involved in this ministry because I didn't want to go there. To be very honest with you, I was scared. I was scared that I was going to make some spontaneous, some sort of unwise, quick decision to remarry when I wasn't really in any condition to be married to anybody. And I'd not only ruined my own life, but somebody else's. So I viewed, to be honest again with you about it, I viewed all women as forbidden fruit. No offense. But I thought the best thing for me to do was stay away. There were some wonderful sisters in the Lord who helped with my rehabilitation in that matter. I don't feel like that anymore, but it was probably a good thing that I went through that. Let me share with you some stories, real life stories. In the Magnolia Messenger, spring 2021, there's an article about 6 people. And these 6 people, they were all married at one time, and their marriage ended, and now they are 3 couples. It is a beautiful story of what the title says: holding another's hand after the passing of your mate. This is a hard thing, especially for the widowed, but I think also for the divorced to consider. Let me share with you Miss Diane's story. She was married for 23 years. She got married when she was 19 years old. He was 23 when they got married. They were married for 23 years. One Sunday morning, she was preparing breakfast, and she sent her 13-year-old daughter. They had 2 daughters, one 13 and one 16 at this point. She sent her 13-year-old daughter down to the basement to get her daddy for breakfast. And that 13-year-old found her father dead on the floor. He had had a terrible, massive heart attack. Out of the blue, Diane now, she, in 2016, is widowed suddenly. This is 2.5 years, not 6 months, not a year. This is 2.5 years after that. She shares with me these thoughts. First of all, it scares me to think about the whole thing of dating and just starting over again. I am not sure I can love someone again like I loved Gary. I'm very lonely, and I miss his companionship every day. We talked about it before. If something were to happen to one of us, we would want the other one to remarry. It was so easy to talk about that when he was here, but now he's gone. And it's much more difficult to talk about now. I would like to be able to love again, but I'm not sure my heart is ready or I'd be able to handle it again. It also scares me. Scares me because I know that if I get remarried, that if my spouse goes before me again, I don't want to have to live through the pain of losing a spouse again. I don't know if I could do it again. Whenever I wrote to Travis Irwin, a friend of mine, and I asked him about his thoughts about marrying again after loss, either divorce or death, here's something he shared with me. He said, my dad died in January of 2013. There was a man at Mom's church whose wife died the day before my dad died. He took care of his wife for 12 years. I performed the wedding ceremony for Bob and Mom last April. Mom is 88 and he is 78. Boy, I'm impressed. When I was at the Woodson Chapel Church outside of Nashville, I met Bill and Burl, had lunch with them, and they shared their story with me. And I said, oh, Burl, you got to tell me that story in writing. So she sends me a cursive, handwritten little summary of their life. Bill and Burl Both had long and happy marriages. Bill's wife had ovarian cancer and suffered for over a year. Verl's husband had Parkinson's disease for 10 years. Both were faithful caregivers to their spouses, and both kept their spouses at home until their death. They experienced the grieving that you typically experience in those kinds of situations. Neither one of them ever had any thoughts about remarrying. After 14 years of being alone, Bill's son suggested that his dad asked Verl out on a date. I'll tell you, life is really weird, how your kids kind of become your parents at some point in time, but it happens. So the son is giving the dad some dating advice. So Bill thinks about it for a while. He gets up the courage to call Verl. He calls Verl and he asks her out to dinner. Being alone for 10 years, Verl was surprised about the invitation. She said yes, and Bill said, "What am I supposed to do now? I ain't done this in years." Well, they started visiting together, enjoying one another's company, and you figure where this is going. They got themselves hitched. And I love the way that she ends this little story. Our lives are so much happier now. God's work can be done together. And there was this lady I met in Medina, Ohio, and she told me this story about how that she lost her husband in 2012. The man lost his wife in 2013. She had been married for 38 and a half years. He'd been married for 40 years. They end up at the same church in Medina, Ohio, which is mid-central North Ohio. And she sent me this little anecdote. She said, "We met Wednesday night for the first time personally by ourselves after Bible study at a local McDonald's. She said, I was so nervous, I was shaking." Now, here's a woman who's been married for 38 and a half years. She's a mature Christian. What in the world has she got to be nervous about sitting across the table from a brother in the Lord? She'd never done this before. She'd never been down this road before. She'd been changed by the marriage that she had and the loss that she experienced. Have you ever thought about how nerve-wracking it can be for people either after divorce or after the loss of a spouse by death to intermingle with the opposite gender? Well, she goes on with the story and explains that he needed to go to Arkansas to visit with his family. While he was in Arkansas visiting with family, she ends up diagnosed with cancer. She tells me she knows what's going to happen at this point. She ends up having treatments and being cared for, and some of you, I'm sure, know about the agony that treatments for cancer can bring into your life. She said she knew she was going to lose him. But while she was puking her guts out and losing every hair on her head, that man was right there with her. And they ended up getting married. Beautiful story of a second commitment. There is a deacon in the Lord's church up in Massillon, Ohio, who wrote to me, and he told me about his mother-in-law remarrying and how that affected his wife. Because his wife had real issues with the man that her mother had married. He talks about how uncomfortable the visits were together. He said his dad remarried, and that was problematic and of great concern and caused problems because he wasn't as active in the Lord's church as he used to be. He married somebody who was not a Christian, and it affected his spiritual health. John and Effie both lost their spouses. They end up getting married, and Effie finds out after they got married that she's married a control freak, to the point that he controlled what TV shows that she watched. But she said, until death do us part. See, that's as true as a commitment in a second marriage as it was in the first marriage. And she's trapped, married to a control freak. Effie ends up getting dementia. And so John says to a friend of mine, I did not get married to care for a woman. I got married so somebody would care for me. the saddest of all stories, was posted publicly on Facebook. Dear Facebook friends, I don't normally write very personal posts, but because most of my friends on Facebook are like family, I want to tell you about the recent events in my life. I know some of you have been very concerned, and I appreciate that more than you know. It's hard to talk to everyone all the time, so maybe this post will answer some questions and elicit some prayers. Please know that this is difficult for me to write, but I feel like I can make everything clear. I'm just ashamed that I made such an impulsive decision. As most of you know, my husband Jim passed away June of 2014. It forever changed my life. I was vulnerable, devastated, and naive. I met someone months later, and we married in July of 2015. June of 2014, notice the time frame, July of 2015. While that may seem very quick, at the time, I did not see that. I was lonely and could never have thought about that issue, but I should have never married so quickly. I don't want to go into all the details on Facebook, but after several rounds of heartache with this person, I'm now divorcing him. Being a teacher in a small town for 25 years lends itself to knowing many, many people. I'm taking back Jim's last name. He was the love of my life and my soulmate. Please pray for me and Lexi as we continue to grieve our loss of Jim and as I move forward from this very embarrassing situation. You all know that all I ever wanted was a loving marriage, like many of you have. Here's a tidbit of statistical information I ran across from the U.S. Census Bureau. Research shows that over half of all remarriages in the first 2 years of widowhood end in divorce. Over half. That shocked me when I ran across that stat. I was so naive, I thought, well, if you have marital experience and you've been through the brutal experience and survived it of loss, you would be way better prepared to be a husband to somebody or a wife to somebody because of that experience. Over half within the 2 years of loss end in divorce. Sometimes what happens with us human beings is we decide to self-medicate. A person with clinical depression, for instance, might choose to self-medicate with alcohol or some other drug, maybe start making meth. Self-medicating is dangerous, and sometimes people self-medicate their grief by marrying again. If I was happy and I was having a good life when I was married, if I get married again, I'll be happy and have a good life again. Maybe, maybe not. I want to show you some things. I'm sure that some of this will be new to you. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, there is no doubt but that somebody who has lost their spouse by death has every right in the world to be remarried. Every bit as much right to marry again as they had the right to marry the first time. But there is a qualifying phrase at the end. It says, only in the Lord. Now, there's two ways that can be taken. One way it could be taken is it has reference to the person you're marrying. That person needs to be a Christian. They're in the Lord. But there's another way it could be viewed, and that is it could have reference to the marrying, not to the person that you're marrying. Let me read to you a little bit of something James Meadows, a brother in the Lord, has written about this several years ago. The phrase in the Lord is adverbial and indicates the sphere in which the action is done. Thus, Paul's language would indicate that widows are free to marry anyone they choose, whether Christian or not, as long as they do not violate some teaching of Jesus about marriage. Philip's translation of this verse reads this way: a woman is bound to her husband while he is alive, but if he dies, she is free to remarry whom she likes, but let her be guided by the Lord. Do you remember why John the Baptist got his head chopped off? He had the guts to say to somebody with great power, Herod, it is unlawful for you to have your brother's wife. See, some people don't have any business being married to some people. It was unlawful for him to be married. Remember the woman at the well? The woman at the well, 5 husbands. And Jesus said, the one you have is not your husband. See, in our culture of loose thinking, where we really disrespect the institution and the relationship of marriage, we can mix up our life situation in regard to our marital life to such an extent that we may not have any business getting married again in the sight of God. I'm not going to go through all the tall weeds of the marriage, divorce, and remarriage issues, but I just point out that there are times that people can be married according to the laws of the land, but yet not be married and sanctioned that marriage in the eyes of God. Herod would be one that would be indicative of that situation. The woman at the well, another proof of that very thing. Which does it mean? Is it the man or the marriage? I wouldn't stake the welfare of my soul on either one. But here's what I would suggest. I would suggest that you marry a Christian and you make sure that you have a right to remarry, and if you've lost your spouse by death, you do. And make sure that that other person has the right to be married too. That way you've covered both bases. Any decision we make in our life needs to be respecting the Lord's will in regard to that life circumstance we're presently in. It's very important that we resolve or mourn the loss of former relationships. Sometimes people who experience divorce remarry way too quickly. Sometimes people who have lost their mate by death marry way too quickly. They have not resolved or mourned the loss of that previous relationship. We need to be careful about our state, our internal, mental, emotional, and spiritual state before we make lifetime commitments in our life. We need to be okay within ourselves and with ourselves. Sometimes we think that the only way we're ever going to be okay is to have a relationship with somebody else. Think about how much pressure that puts on that relationship. If the only way I'm going to be okay is I have a relationship, a unique, exclusive relationship with this one person, look at how much pressure that puts on that one relationship. I would suggest that we keep in mind that younger widows are even encouraged, not just permitted, according to 1 Corinthians 7, but even encouraged to remarry. Note to men sitting in this room, notice the phrase, manage the household. If she wants a purple room, go to Home Depot and buy purple paint. You may be the head of the house. She is the manager of the house. Happy wife, you know, happy life. Here's something that I think, again, it would be good for us to revisit a familiar passage. This is Philippians chapter 4, starting at verse 11. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. That is a bold declaration. It's also a universal declaration. He said, it doesn't matter. It does not matter what my present circumstances are in a broken world. It doesn't matter. He goes on to explain in more detail in verse 12. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry. Both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. A lot of times, verse 13 is thought to be a universal declaration, and it's not. Lifting that passage out of context creates nothing but a pretext that's inaccurate. He's talking about contentment. And in regard to contentment, what he is saying is, it doesn't matter what my circumstances are, I can be content through the strength that Jesus Christ provides me in my life. That's what it says. He's talking about contentment. Now, I want you to think about this passage in regard to what he has said here when he says, I have learned in whatever state. Now, I'm not talking about Ohio, Tennessee, Alabama. The Apostle Paul is talking about life circumstances No matter what your life circumstances are. Now, I'm going to plug in a few words here, and we're going to make this more thought-provoking. I have learned in whatever financial state I am to be content. Can a poverty-stricken person be content? Through Jesus Christ who strengthens them, yes, with an exclamation mark. I have learned in whatever physical state I am. Can a cancer patient be content? Through Jesus Christ who strengthens them, yes, exclamation mark. I have learned in whatever marital state, now we're getting personal. I have learned in whatever marital state I am to be content. In a coupled world, that's tough. Being a human being in a coupled world, that's tough. I've had a lot of widowed people come to me and say, well, when do you think it would be good to remarry? And I know what they're looking for. They're looking for a number. How many months? Let me make a note here. Dean says, how many months? How many years? You can't look at it that way. Here's my classic response now to that question. I think the safest time for a person to remarry after divorce, if they have the right to remarry, or after the death of their spouse, is when they have exercised their relationship with the Lord and cultivated the intimacy with the Lord that He desires and that we need, and we have found contentment in our widowhood. That is a great time to choose to remarry. Instead of marrying out of desperation, out of need, you marry out of desire. See, all we need is Jesus. We don't need fancy clothes. We don't need a big bank account. We don't need health. We don't need a marital mate, though they are a rich, rich blessing. It took me a good while to get to that point, but I confess I'm a slow learner. It probably took me about 3 years to get to the point where I felt content. I thought, well, if this is the way it's going to be, looking in my marital case or condition, I decided me and the Lord were going to be just fine. Now, we can desire something and yet still be content. A cancer patient desires remission. They may or may not receive that. Whether they receive it or not doesn't change the fact that through Jesus Christ that strengthens them, they can still be content. The most important thing when we've gone through a terribly difficult time in our life, like loss of our marriage, is for us to work on our relationship with the Lord. And when we do that, we can find contentment and also at the same time be preparing ourselves for the possibility of making a wise decision about another marriage. Obviously, some of the personal stories I shared to you were beautiful and touching. That second marriage was good. I met one lady in Humboldt, Tennessee, who came to me and said that she had been widowed 3 times. And she could tell from my body language that I was shocked when I heard that, because I'd never run across anybody like that at the time. And here's what she said. I was really touched by this. She said, I had 3 wonderful Christian men in my life. That's gratitude. After losing 3 wonderful Christian men in her life. If you're sitting in this room and you're married, I want to challenge you. Don't you dare take for granted, not for a day, not for an hour, the honor that you have to be in that relationship. It is an unparalleled blessing of life. Do you know what some of us would give to have a second bite of that apple? That it could happen for us? I understand why mistakes are made in regard to that, because sometimes our human desires can be so strong and so powerful, and our feeler can drive us more than our thinker. We need to exercise caution whether we're marrying a first time or sometime after the first time. As a matter of fact, godliness with contentment, that means we're rich. That's the great gain right there. To exercise ourselves spiritually to the point where we have devoted ourselves wholly to the Lord and we can find contentment no matter what it is in our life, we are rich at that point. I'm so thankful that we have some young people in this room. What should be considered before you get married? This is true before you get married the first time, and this is true any other time after that first marriage. One of the things we have to realize is there are myths about marriage, and these myths are promoted in a fallen culture like the one that we live in. There are some myths that are dealt with in a book called Fit to be Tied. I use this book in premarital counseling for many years. It is a great book. Have you ever known anybody who was married and unhappy? Well, that blows that one, doesn't it? Marriage ensures my happiness. What about marriage will heal my brokenness? What if there is up here two people, flawed people, only kind of people there are, flawed people, and the girl has an eating disorder. She's got that brokenness. Now, when she says, I do, and she's married, is she still going to have that brokenness? She's bringing it into the marriage. I hope that she's talked to that boy about it, that man about it. Let's say the guy has clinical depression, which, by the way, is nothing to be ashamed of. If you have a mental illness, or you know of somebody you love who has a mental illness, it is nothing to be ashamed of. Just like it's nothing to be ashamed of to have cancer, a physical illness. In our culture, though, sometimes we have the wrong view about mental illness. Whether it's schizophrenia or maybe it might be clinical depression or any other mental illness. If you say I do at the marriage altar, are you still going to have that brokenness? Yes. There are myths about marriage that people sometimes will base their relationships on, and let's be honest about it. Some people are married, yet very much alone. The most valuable quote out of this book, I can quote it for you word for word. The most miserable people in the world, that's what this quote is about. The most miserable people in the world are not single people who want to be married, but married people who realize their marriage was a mistake. Trapped in a mistake. That is misery. We need to be careful to make sure that we don't build a marriage on a myth. Second marriages have a higher rate of failure than do first marriages. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have a second marriage. We just realized, though, hopefully looking at the statistics, that this is a challenge. The divorce rate for first marriages is somewhere between 35 to 50%, but for second marriages, it's estimated to be as high as over 60%. Could we at least agree in regard to that in the Lord phrase, relative to second marriages, that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, no matter what you think about the specific nature of that phrase in the Lord, can we at least agree it is like a red flag or a yellow flag flashing caution, caution, be careful. It is an exclusive statement. We need to be careful. I am not here discouraging anybody. I am encouraging us to realize how precious it is to be married. What a deep commitment and lifetime commitment that is. And make sure that when we make that commitment, we stick with that commitment through thick and thin, whether it's a first one or one after that. The most important thing that a couple needs to have in any marriage, first or any after, is spiritual compatibility. I'm not talking about two people who have a baptismal certificate. I'm not talking about two people who come into the same church building and worship on Sundays. Let me tell you about the woman. If you want to, you can help me find her. My number, by the way, is on the back of the business cards for the ministry. The only woman I will ever marry is a woman who loves somebody else more than me. And his name is Jesus. Because that's the only kind of person that I want to be. You take two people who love the Lord more than anybody else or anything else, and they make a lifetime commitment to one another. It doesn't matter the differences that they may have. I know a lady out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who in her early 30s married a man in his early 60s. They had 30 years of great marriage, she tells me. Doesn't matter what difference you may have in regard to your skin color or your socioeconomic background. You can have a magnificent marriage when you yourself and the person you marry love the Lord more than anybody else or anything else. Randy Pope has written a book called Finding Your $1 Million Mate. You know, any book with a title like that, I'm going to buy. The only failing in this book, and it's a great book, highly recommended, for young people and anybody considering a marriage after they are youthful. The only weakness in this book is the place to start finding a $1 million mate is looking in the mirror. I don't need to be looking for a woman who loves the Lord more than anybody else or anything else until I have embraced that same character. There is nothing more important than spiritual compatibility. When you have that, you have a roadmap for your life. You have a common authority that you're going to recognize God and His will. You have a relationship with the Lord that can help you to walk through any storm, and the storms are inevitable in your marriage. And that is the trump, I'm somewhat hesitant to use that phrase, it's the trump card of marriage. Spiritual compatibility, as I described it. Time is the acid test of a relationship. Whenever we start interacting with people of the opposite gender, we always put the best foot forward. We always do. Now, after a while, you kind of relax, and you're not always putting your best foot forward. And she finds out some things about him, and he starts finding out some things about her. My wife, as a teenager, was very careful to never let me see her in hair rollers. Now, you young people, you're going to have to Google that one too, okay? But after I said I do, I had to sleep with that woman some nights in hair rollers. You see, over time, you get to know that person better. You get to see them and how they celebrate. You get to see them when they're troubled, when they're stressed, when they're aggravated, and how about their anger management. You get to see them and how they use their finances and how they interact with other people, how they deal with human relationships. Time is the acid test of a relationship. Over time, you have experiences where you make observations that can help you create relationships. And remember, life is about three things. Remember if you were at the workshop on Friday? Life is people and relationships and experiences. That's what it is. Time helps you become more aware of who that person really is. People can act for a while, but they won't act forever. There's family blending. This woman that you may volunteer to help me find has to pass several tests. Now, it's pass-fail. She doesn't have to get an A, okay? It's just pass-fail. I have 3 daughters. I have 3 sons-in-law. I have 5 grandchildren. And then there's me. Now, I personally would not marry someone who caused me to become relationally distant from any of my family. Nor would I want to marry any woman where her marrying me would cause her to be relationally distant from any of her children or grandchildren. Family's important. I hope family's important to you. Now, not everybody who's been widowed or divorced feels that way. I have seen people say it in writing. It's my life. It's not my kid's life. I can date when I want to date. I'll marry when I want to marry. Well, there are consequences to that, just like there are consequences to my personal philosophy. But what we have to keep in mind is that it's not just two, but there's also families that are touched by two people choosing to get married. There are expectations. The expectations we have are from our past. Now, some of us have expectations about marriage because of what we saw with our mother and our father. A boy learns how to be a husband first by observing his father. That's scary, guys, isn't it? No, maybe I should say that's scary, guys, women, isn't it? And that's the same way a little girl learns to be a wife. She observes things in regard to her mother. And then, if you've had a marriage previously, you're bringing some expectations from your experience with that person that you were married to the first time. Let me tell you about the first dumb thing my wife did. Now, she was only 19 years old, so I have to cut her some slack here. We got hitched up in Northeast Ohio, and that same afternoon, we started driving to West Tennessee because I was going to start my sophomore year at Freed-Hardeman College, it was called, in 1972. One day in that little trailer that we paid $75 a month rent on, those were the good old days, she had the gall to do this. She got a can of pork and beans out of the cabinet. She opened those pork and beans, and she poured them in the bowl and put them on the table. I couldn't believe it. I was shocked. My mother heated those before she put them in the bowl and put them on the table. You see, an expectation from the past. Well, there are expectations. We need to talk about those. The key to intimacy, I'm talking about closeness in relationships. The key to intimacy is transparency. If we're transparent, we can be close. If we hide things, if we're not transparent, we're never going to have a high degree of closeness. We need to talk about a lot of things, among them, things that have to do with expectations. Health and sexual issues are going to need to be discussed. One of the most romantic things that I'm going to experience with this woman, who's going to be so daring as to marry me, is we're going to go out to Walmart and we're going to buy a rod and a reel and we're going to wrap it up just like a gift, and we're going to go to my doctor's office. We're going to give him the Zebco rod and reel, and we're going to have him tell us about my health. And then, now this is very romantic, hand in hand, okay? We go to the candy store and we get some flowers and some candy, and we go to her doctor. We give her doctor the gift of appreciation as her doctor explains to us about her health. Do you think there's ever been somebody that married somebody where they didn't know about the health condition of that person? Shake your head like this. It happens way too much. Again, transparency. Things need to be discussed before we make a lifetime commitment. This is so complicated. By the way, if you decide to help me find my next wife, I would like to recommend that she also have $1 million, okay? I want to throw that in there. And I forgot to mention, how about drop dead gorgeous? That doesn't have to be the number one thing, but I'd like that to be on the list too. Well, let's assume that I do marry a millionaire. And let's just throw in, now this is not necessary, this is an elective, not a requirement. Let's say she has 3 sons. I've got 3 daughters. So we get married, she's a millionaire, and she dies on me. She dies first. Are her 3 sons going to have to split their 1/3 to share with my daughters? Now, what if we get married and I die first? I have been a preacher all my life. I leave behind $1.50. Are my girls going to have to give those boys a quarter? Well, see how complicated this is? So complicated that sometimes when adult children get real touchy about what they consider their inheritance, which is not their inheritance until the parent dies. Sometimes maybe even a prenuptial agreement. And I've been death on prenuptial agreements since we started that crazy option. That programs a marriage for failure. But I can understand maybe in an extreme case where maybe a couple in a second marriage who have children, adult children especially, that maybe they would choose to calm those children down by creating a prenuptial agreement. What about the wills? What about the estates? What about the finances? Is it going to be her money and my money? Are we going to throw our money together? This is very complicated, do you see? And then, what about, if you find her, it'd be really nice for a house like on the Gulf. Tampa would be nice. Clearwater. But are we going to live in her house, or are we going to live in my house? Or are we going to live in both? The secretary of the church in Summerville, South Carolina, lost her husband, and she is now married to a preacher in North Florida. He is not yet able to retire, but he will shortly. But for the first few years of their marriage, he's living in North Florida. She is in Charleston or in Summerville, South Carolina. Sometimes they'll meet in between. Sometimes she'll go down there. Sometimes he'll come up there. Eventually, when he retires, he's going to move up to Summerville, South Carolina. There's a lot of things that need to be talked about before you say, I do. The point that I'm trying to drive home is that with human relationships, there are risks. When you're making a lifetime commitment to another person, you need to understand that there are risks, and you cannot eliminate risks. But what you can do is you can reduce risks by considering factors that can help you reduce those risks. Remarriage, it says, at midlife or later, to put it bluntly, is complicated. Kind of like two major corporations trying to merge. It's something that needs to be studied and needs to be worked on. Sprint and T-Mobile, it took a number of months, many months, to do the research and homework. Sometimes two corporations will study all that and they'll back off because they see warning flags. We need to realize that there's a lot to consider, whether it's a first marriage or any one after that. Again, I say this, if you're married, appreciate it. You'll not be able to keep it as long as you want. I can pretty well guarantee that. I hate it when we lose things that are so precious in our life. But it happens. The only way a good marriage ends, there's a lot of ways bad marriages end, but there's only one way a good marriage ends, and that's death and somebody left behind. That's not the end of the world for the person left behind, but it's one tough journey in a coupled world after that. But through Jesus Christ, who strengthens us, we can find contentment no matter what. I hope if you're not in a right relationship with the Lord tonight, I hope that you are very discontented. As a matter of fact, my hope and prayer would be that you don't sleep a wink until you are motivated to make sure that you are right with the Lord. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. We're challenged to be faithful, even to the extent of giving our life for Him. That is the kind of faithfulness that we need to embrace in our life. If you have wandered away from the Lord and you need to repent, you need to recommit yourself to the Lord and love Him more than anybody else or anything else. We're going to sing a song of invitation, and you're welcome to come and let us see what maybe we could do to help you. If you've never become a Christian, here's what I suggest you think about. What if you were to do what they did in the first century? Wouldn't that make you what they were? In the first century, in the book of Acts on, we read about people becoming Christians and how to live the Christian life. If you did what they did in the book of Acts to become a Christian, that would make you what they were, a Christian. We read in the book about the gospel being taught and preached, planted in the heart, received with meekness. And then we read about them turning away from sin, turning to God, and with a simple trusting faith, being baptized into Jesus. Why be baptized? Well, Acts 2:38, for the forgiveness of sins. Ananias told Saul, arise and be baptized and wash away your sins. You can have that blessing tonight. And you can leave contented because the blood of Jesus is going to continually cleanse your sins, 1 John 1 verse 7, until the day you draw your last breath. If you need to become a Christian, we want to encourage you to make that decision now. Let's go ahead and stand while we sing.